The late September afternoon had draped Blount Hall in golden light, transforming the annual St. Mary Mead flower show into a picture of rural perfection. Sunlight danced across silver trophies in the horticultural tent, while the gentle hum of satisfied voices drifted from the tea pavilion where Mrs. Bantry presided over her domain of cucumber sandwiches and Victoria sponge. Children raced between the stalls with sticky fingers and bright faces, their laughter mingling with the distant strains of the brass band's rendition of Gilbert and Sullivan. Miss Jane Marple made her way slowly through the displays, pausing to admire a particularly fine arrangement of dahlias while her sharp blue eyes observed the subtle dramas unfolding around her. She noted how Tom Hartwell, the recently dismissed groundsman, lingered at the edge of the festivities with barely concealed resentment, and how young Gerald Ashworth was paying particular attention to the widow Mrs. Carmichael, whose late husband had left her comfortably situated. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you." Dr. Haydock approached with his wife Margaret trailing behind, her pale hands clutching a small handbag with unusual firmness. "Margaret's dahlias took second place this year." "Quite an achievement?" Margaret Haydock managed a wan smile, though Miss Marple noticed how her eyes kept darting toward the ancient wishing well beneath the old oak tree. "Mrs. Vale seemed quite interested in the well when she arrived," Margaret said, her voice carrying an odd note. "She was asking Hart about its history." Miss Marple's attention sharpened imperceptibly. Mrs. Rosalind Vale had taken Dower Cottage 6 months prior, maintaining a quiet reserve that had made her more intriguing than troublesome to the village gossips. "How fascinating." "I believe it dates back to the 14th century, doesn't it?" "Indeed," Dr. Haydock replied, but his wife had already moved away, drawn by some urgent need to examine the jam competition. The afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm of village life at its most harmonious. Miss Marple had settled on a bench near the well, ostensibly to rest, but actually to observe the dynamics playing out around her. The heavy oak cover that protected the ancient stone shaft sat securely in place, its iron hinges gleaming dully in the afternoon light. It was just past 3 o'clock when young Timothy Bantry came running across the lawn, his face white with shock and his voice cracking as he called for help. The boy's distress cut through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife, drawing an immediate crowd toward the wishing well. Mrs. Rosalind Vale lay at the bottom of the ancient stone shaft, her dark dress spread around her like the petals of some tragic flower. The heavy oak cover that normally protected the well lay askew, as though hastily replaced after creating the fatal opening. "Terrible accident," Colonel Blount was saying, his military bearing shaken. "That cover weighs a good deal. She must have been leaning over to look down and somehow dislodged it." "Dreadful business." Dr. Haydock had already descended using Hart's rope and ladder, but even from above it was clear that help had come too late. As he called up, confirming the worst, a collective gasp rose from the onlookers. "Poor soul," Mrs. Pratt, the postmistress, was saying to anyone who would listen. "Though I must say, she seemed rather agitated when she came to collect her post yesterday. Quite sharp with me when I mentioned what a lovely day it was. Not like her usual manner at all." Miss Marple said nothing, but her keen eyes were taking in details that others, in their shock and distress, were overlooking. The heavy oak cover would indeed require considerable strength to move, certainly more than a slight woman like Mrs. Vale could manage alone. She had seen Hart and another man struggle with it during maintenance just last month. More intriguing still was the small piece of blue ribbon caught on the cover's iron hinge, a delicate cerulean silk that matched none of the vibrant floral decorations adorning the show. It was an incongruous detail that seemed to whisper of secrets. As the police constable arrived to take charge of the scene, Miss Marple noticed something else that struck her as peculiar. Mrs. Vale's gloves, visible even from above, appeared remarkably clean and undamaged for someone who had supposedly struggled with the heavy well cover before falling to her death. The white kid leather showed no tears, no dirt, No signs of the desperate scrabbling one might expect from someone fighting for purchase, as ancient stone and iron gave way beneath their hands. The afternoon's golden promise had turned to shadow, and as the crowd began to disperse in hushed, troubled groups, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around the well with the particular attention she reserved for puzzles that presented themselves as simpler than they truly were. The woman who had fallen into the well, she reflected with growing certainty, had not fallen alone. The idyllic village afternoon had shattered, leaving behind questions that would not be easily answered, and a growing suspicion that this tragedy was far more complex than a simple, if dreadful, accident. By evening, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar efficiency that transforms village networks into instruments of both comfort and scrutiny. The Blue Boar's public bar hummed with subdued conversation, while telephone lines carried whispered accounts to neighbouring parishes. What had begun as a perfect autumn afternoon had transformed into something altogether more troubling, though most villagers still clung to the comfortable notion of tragic accident. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham as the last light faded, his practical manner suggesting a man more accustomed to rural mishaps than deliberate crime. Miss Marple observed from her cottage window as his motor car pulled up to the police house, noting how quickly he dismissed the constable's hesitant suggestions about the scene's peculiarities. Straightforward accident, by all accounts, she heard him telling Dr. Haydock the following morning outside the post office. Unfortunate, but these old wells can be treacherous. The cover mechanism was probably weakened by age and weather. His methodical questioning revealed the basic facts of Mrs. Vale's life with admirable efficiency. She had been a widow of modest means, having moved to St. Mary Mead after her husband's death in London 6 months prior. Her references had been impeccable, her rent paid promptly, and her behaviour consistently that of a genteel woman seeking quiet retirement in the countryside. "No known enemies," Colonel Blount confirmed when questioned about his tenant. "Kept to herself, but always pleasant when we encountered each other. Seemed to have quite a knowledge of local history, actually. Asked several questions about the property's past and spent considerable time walking the boundaries with what appeared to be surveying equipment." Yet beneath these surface reassurances, Miss Marple detected undercurrents that spoke of deeper complexities. Mrs. Pratt, never one to let information pass without commentary, inserted herself into the investigation with the determined efficiency of a woman who considered herself the village's unofficial intelligence service. If I may say so, Inspector, Mrs. Vale seemed quite distressed yesterday when she collected her letters, Mrs. Pratt declared, adjusting her spectacles. Most unusual for such a composed lady. She was normally so polite, so measured in her speech. But yesterday she seemed almost angry about something. In what way? Craddock's interest sharpened. Well, after collecting her post, 2 letters from London, both hand-marked, she was arguing with someone near the telephone box. Quite heated, it appeared, though I couldn't make out all the words from inside the shop. But I did hear her say quite distinctly, "You won't get away with it this time." Miss Marple, who had been examining the morning's selection of postcards with apparent absorption, found her attention drawn to this detail. Mrs. Pratt's position behind the post office counter provided an excellent vantage point for observing village comings and goings, and her memory for such details was remarkably accurate. "Could you identify the other party to this argument?" Inspector Craddock asked. Mrs. Pratt's expression grew thoughtful. "The person had their back to me, partially obscured by the telephone box. But from their posture and manner of dress, someone local certainly. The voice seemed familiar, though I couldn't place it precisely. When Inspector Craddock interviewed Hart about the well's maintenance, the groundsman's responses carried an evasive quality that seemed excessive for such straightforward questions. His recent dismissal from Colonel Blount's service added an uncomfortable edge to the encounter. "The cover's been secure for months," Hart insisted, his weathered hands working nervously at his cap. "Checked it myself after the spring rains. No reason it should have given way like that." "When did you last inspect the mechanism?" Craddock pressed. Hart's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. Must have been, 3 weeks past. Maybe 4? Hard to say exactly. This uncertainty seemed uncharacteristic. For a man whose professional reputation depended on methodical attention to estate maintenance, more troubling was Hart's confusion when asked about the well-security chain. Chain? He repeated, glancing toward the oak tree. Well, yes, there was a chain. Bolted proper it was. Don't know what happened to it. Margaret Haydock's behaviour proved equally intriguing. The doctor's wife, typically nervous but functional, seemed particularly affected by the tragedy. Her usual energy had intensified into palpable agitation. At the village shop, Miss Marple observed her fumbling with her purse, dropping coins and snapping at the shop assistant over trivial matters. When their eyes met across the aisle, Margaret's were wide and haunted. Quickly averting their gaze, as evening approached and Inspector Craddock prepared his preliminary report, Miss Marple reflected on the day's accumulating details. The official investigation would likely conclude accidental death, but the subtle inconsistencies she had observed suggested a more complex truth. The argument Mrs. Pratt had witnessed, Hart's evasiveness about both timing and security measures, Margaret Haydock's fearful behaviour, and Mrs. Vale's recent preoccupation with local history and property boundaries formed a pattern that spoke of secrets rather than simple misfortune. The village was settling into its evening routine, but beneath the surface tranquility, Miss Marple sensed the tension that comes when ordinary people find themselves touched by extraordinary events. Tomorrow would bring deeper questions, and she suspected more troubling answers. The morning after Mrs. Vale's tragic death brought one of those deceptively peaceful September days that seemed to mock the presence of tragedy. Miss Marple tied her gardening apron with deliberate care, selected 3 late roses from the bush by her gate, and set out with the gentle purposefulness of a woman making neighbourly rounds. She had learned long ago that grief often revealed more truth than direct questioning, and that sympathy became most useful when it appeared in small, ordinary kindnesses. Her first destination was Dower Cottage itself, where Colonel Blount had thoughtfully arranged for his parlour-maid, Alice, to maintain the property until proper arrangements could be made. The cottage, with its neat gravel path and square windows, seemed to hold its breath in the morning stillness, as though waiting for its mistress to return. Alice opened the door with the careful manner of someone entrusted with more responsibility than she had anticipated. "Thank you, miss," she said gratefully when Miss Marple presented the roses. Such a thoughtful gesture. The Colonel said there'd be an inventory soon, and Inspector Craddock was here quite late last evening, going through Mrs. Vale's papers. Miss Marple stepped into the tidy sitting room, noting how the morning light revealed details that might have been missed in yesterday's confusion. The writing desk by the window bore the faint impressions of recent correspondence on its leather blotter, and a small china tray held several envelope corners that had been torn away. The careful habit of someone who valued privacy. Mrs. Vale was very particular about her correspondence, Alice confided, clearly grateful for sympathetic company. These past weeks, she'd been receiving letters that seemed to upset her considerably. 2 from London last week alone, both bearing the letterhead of Lincoln's Inn. She'd read them with such intensity, miss, and afterwards she'd paced the room as though working out some difficult problem. How distressing for her, Miss Marple murmured, arranging the roses in a small vase. Did she mention what troubled her? Alice glanced toward the hallway before lowering her voice. Just once, miss. After that second London letter arrived, she said to me, quite determined like, "I mean to set matters right." Alice, for someone who didn't get the chance. Then she gathered up a leather portfolio, quite official-looking it was, and took the early train to London. Came back that same evening looking both satisfied and worried, if you understand my meaning. This detail aligned perfectly with Mrs. Pratt's observation about Mrs. Vale's recent agitation. From Dower Cottage, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found Griselda Clement struggling with parish correspondence in the morning room. The vicar's wife received both visitor and jam with characteristic warmth, though her usual scattered energy seemed more focused than usual. "Such a terrible shock about Mrs. Vale," Griselda said, clearing space on the cluttered table. "Though I must say, she'd been spending considerable time here recently, examining our parish records with the most methodical attention. Leonard was quite impressed by her knowledge of local history, actually." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. "How fascinating. Was she researching her family connections, perhaps? That's what we assumed initially, but her questions were rather more specific than genealogical curiosity would suggest. She was particularly interested in the registers from 20 to 25 years ago, asking about families who had left the area suddenly or under unusual circumstances." Griselda paused, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. She mentioned a name, Sarah Whitmore, and asked whether Leonard recalled any irregularities with the church-building fund from that period. The name struck Miss Marple with the force of half-forgotten memory. Sarah Whitmore, a young woman who had vanished from St. Mary Mead decades earlier, leaving behind whispers of scandal and a mysteriously depleted church fund. The engagement to young Dr. Haydock that had ended so abruptly, the hurried explanations about sudden departures and family emergencies that had never quite satisfied village curiosity. "I believe I recall something of the matter," Miss Marple said carefully, "though the details have grown rather hazy with time." Exactly what I told Mrs. Vale, but she seemed to have access to information that filled in many of the gaps. She mentioned consulting legal records and property transfers, as though she were building a case rather than simply satisfying curiosity. Miss Marple's next stop was the council office in Much Benham, where a perfectly legitimate inquiry about footpath maintenance provided opportunity for broader conversation. Mr. Simmons, the junior clerk, remembered Mrs. Vale's visits with remarkable clarity. "Most thorough researcher I've encountered in years," he said admiringly. She'd requested the enclosure awards for Blount lands, conveyance records for Dower Cottage, and detailed information about several property transfers from the 1920s and 30s. Made extensive notes with a small camera, quite professional, really. "How industrious of her," Miss Marple observed. "Did she mention the purpose of her research?" Mr. Simmons glanced around the empty office before leaning forward conspiratorially. She said she was investigating what she termed a historical injustice involving fraudulent property transfers and missing persons. Asked specifically about death certificates and whether our records from that period were complete. Mentioned something about proving that certain transactions had been conducted under false pretenses. This information painted a picture of systematic investigation rather than casual curiosity. Mrs. Vale had clearly been building a case, gathering documentary evidence to support claims that reached back decades into St. Mary Mead's carefully buried past. On her way back through the village, Miss Marple encountered Gerald Ashworth near the post office, his timing seeming remarkably convenient for someone claiming to be out for a casual stroll. His charm was immediately apparent, though she noted how his pleasant manner carried an undercurrent of calculation. "Miss Marple, how fortuitous. I was hoping to discuss arrangements for Mrs. Vale's memorial service," he said, lifting his hat with practiced courtesy. "As one of the newer residents, I feel we should show proper respect for her memory." His concern seemed genuine enough, but Miss Marple observed how quickly he steered the conversation toward Mrs. Vale's recent activities. "She seemed quite dedicated to her historical research," he remarked with studied casualness. "I encountered her several times at the railway station, always carrying that leather portfolio and looking remarkably determined for someone supposedly enjoying retirement. You're very observant, Mr. Ashworth." "One develops an eye for such things," he replied lightly, though something in his expression suggested his observations served purposes beyond mere neighbourly interest. Miss Marple's final visit was to Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found Margaret Haydock tending the garden with an intensity that seemed excessive for routine maintenance. The doctor's wife attacked the rose bushes with pruning shears, her movements sharp and agitated. "Such a shock for everyone," Miss Marple commented gently. "I do hope you're managing well, my dear." Margaret's response was immediate and vehement. "It's absolutely dreadful. All these questions and investigations, as though any of us could have prevented such a terrible accident." Her hands shook as she continued her aggressive pruning, and when Dr. Haydock emerged from his surgery, her agitation became even more pronounced. "Margaret's been quite distressed," the doctor explained apologetically. "She's always been sensitive to village tragedies, but Mrs. Vale's death has affected her more than usual." As evening approached, and Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the day's discoveries. Mrs. Vale had clearly come to St. Mary Mead with a specific purpose, related to the decades-old disappearance of Sarah Whitmore and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the church building fund scandal. Her methodical research, consultation with London solicitors, and determination to set matters right suggested she had uncovered evidence of historical fraud and possibly worse. They, to intensity of certain villagers' reactions, particularly Margaret Haydock's obvious distress, and Gerald Ashworth's calculating interest, indicated that Mrs. Vale's investigations had touched on matters that some people preferred to keep buried. The threads of a complex web were beginning to emerge, connecting past injustices with present respectability in ways that suggested Mrs. Vale's death was far from the simple accident it appeared to be. Someone in St. Mary Mead had built their current life upon the foundation of Sarah Whitmore's disappearance and the church fund scandal. Mrs. Vale's determined investigation had threatened to expose that carefully constructed deception, and she had paid for her persistence with her life. Inspector Craddock arrived at Blount Hall early, his boots still damp from the dew, and requested to see Tom Hartwell at once. The former groundsman, lingering at the gate lodge with only a battered suitcase for company, responded with a mixture of resignation and brittle defiance. Craddock began without preamble, the tap of his pencil against his notebook sharp in the quiet. "You were seen arguing with Mrs. Vale the day before her death, Mr. Hartwell, near the post office, and you've recently been dismissed from Colonel Blount's employ. You understand why I must ask where you were between 2:30 and 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the flower show?" Hartwell glanced away, jaw set. "I was up by the north meadow fixing the fence where the sheep broke through. Came down by the spinney and reached the green just after 3 when I saw everyone running for the well. Went there like the rest." Craddock's gaze shifted toward the heavy oak well cover, now guarded by a constable. "You said yesterday you hadn't checked the mechanism for 4 weeks, but Colonel Blount says you had access to the chain and padlock." "I said 3 or 4 weeks. Time runs together," Hartwell answered, voice tight. "As for the chain, it was there last I looked. If it's gone, I didn't take it." Craddock's tone sharpened. "You have debts, Hartwell?" "Considerable ones. I have a note here from Sergeant Wallace. You owe Bilson nearly £20. There's also your caution for poaching and missing tools from the estate." Hartwell coloured, fists clenched. "I'm not proud of all that." "But I never heard anyone." The argument with Mrs. Vale, she asked who had keys to the sheds and if the well cover had ever been tampered with. She said people around here thought they could do as they pleased because no one remembered anymore. I told her I was the wrong man to cross if she was accusing me. That's all. Miss Marple, who had wandered up from the lane with the innocent purpose of a morning stroll, watched the exchange with mild, unassuming interest. She studied Hartwell's hands, rough, calloused, honest in their way, and his boots, which were cleaner than expected for a morning's work. She filed the detail away, a single stitch in a growing tapestry. Colonel Blount, appearing on the path, added his voice with discomfort. Inspector Hartwell was dismissed for cause. Petrol siphoned, tools missing. He's not trustworthy. I regret this business with Mrs. Vale, but the facts are what they are. Craddock nodded, making another note. Thank you, Colonel. As the inspector led Hartwell away toward the police house at Much Benham, the village seemed to draw a collective breath. The narrative was settling. Hartwell, with his debts and sullenness, was the easy villain. At the post office, Mrs. Pratt recounted the argument. Hartwell's temper, Mrs. Vale's frosty composure. She told him he'd get nothing from her. His face was thunder. Miss Marple, on her way to the bakery, heard Mrs. Bantry's verdict. Poor Mrs. Vale, so unfortunate in her staff. One really must be careful these days. The villagers, she noted, were almost too eager to see Hartwell taken away, their relief palpable. It was as though having a familiar scapegoat allowed them to settle their unease and close ranks. Yet something nagged at Miss Marple, the timeline for one. Hartwell claimed to be at the Green Man public house from 2 until 4, but she remembered seeing him by the old stone wall at Blount Hall, closer to 3:30, talking animatedly with someone she couldn't identify. Why would he misstate his whereabouts? Was it guilt or something else? Fear of being seen with the wrong person, perhaps? Margaret Haydock drew her interest next. The doctor's wife, always anxious, now seemed oddly relieved. Miss Marple caught her watching Inspector Craddock's passing car with a flicker of something close to satisfaction, quickly concealed by fresh distress. In the garden, Margaret's hands trembled as she dead-headed flowers. "Such a dreadful thing, Miss Marple," she murmured, "but at least it seems the police have a suspect. We can all rest easier, can't we?" Miss Marple's gaze fell to a narrow blue ribbon on Margaret's hat. A trivial detail, perhaps, but its colour matched the silk caught on the well's hinge. A coincidence or a clue? She let the thought drift for now. Gerald Ashworth, meanwhile, continued his rounds of charm. He offered sympathy and theories alike, always deferring to the official investigation. Miss Marple had heard whispers of his overdue bills and noted the strain behind his pleasant facade. "A pity about Hartwell," he confided at her gate. He was always a rough diamond. One wonders if his temper got the better of him. Mrs. Vale didn't tolerate nonsense. His tone was sympathetic, yet Miss Marple sensed he was nudging her, and the village, toward the conclusion already forming in Craddock's mind. As Craddock prepared to take Hartwell for formal questioning, the story seemed to write itself, a man with motive, opportunity and a history of petty crime. The village, eager for closure, pressed the narrative forward. Yet Miss Marple, standing by the garden gate, felt a familiar unease. In her experience, the simplest answer, especially when so many were eager to believe it, was rarely the right one. She reviewed the facts, Mrs. Vale's inquiries into old scandals, the argument with Hartwell, the villagers' relief, the blue ribbon, and Gerald Ashworth's eager helpfulness. The timeline did not fit as neatly as everyone wished. There were secrets beneath the surface, resentments, unfinished business from years ago that pointed to a more intricate, carefully planned crime. As the sun dipped behind the roofs of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple resolved to pursue the quiet threads others overlooked. The village had found its villain, but she suspected the real danger lay elsewhere, behind a mask of respectability and relief. The past, she knew, was never quite finished with St. Mary Mead. The morning after Tom Hartwell's questioning brought a deceptive calm to St. Mary Mead, as though the village were collectively exhaling after holding its breath. Inspector Craddock's apparent satisfaction with his primary suspect seemed to settle over the community like a comfortable blanket. But Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that others dismissed as inconsequential. The blue ribbon caught on the well's hinge continued to flutter in her memory with persistent significance. She made her way to the vicarage under the pretense of discussing memorial arrangements for Mrs. Vale. But her true purpose lay in examining the collection of parish photographs that Griselda had mentioned. In Leonard Clement's study, surrounded by theological texts and decades of village history captured in sepia and early colour, Miss Marple found what her instincts had been seeking. The photograph, dated from 1928, showed the church fete committee arranged in formal rows, their faces bright with the optimism of a prosperous summer. In the back row stood a young woman whose dark hair was adorned with a ribbon of distinctive cerulean blue, the exact shade and quality of silk now caught on the Wells iron hinge. The woman's face, though partially turned away, possessed a delicate beauty that spoke of someone accustomed to admiration. "Sarah Whitmore," Griselda confirmed, when Miss Marple inquired. She was engaged to young Dr. Haydock at the time, though the engagement ended rather suddenly when she left the village. There was some unpleasantness about the church building fund, if I recall correctly. The connection crystallized with startling clarity. This was no coincidence. The ribbon was a signature, a deliberate link between Mrs. Vale's death and the decades-old scandal that had driven Sarah Whitmore from St. Mary Mead. Someone had placed it there, intentionally, either as a twisted form of justice or to send a message that only those familiar with the village's buried secrets would understand. Miss Marple's next investigation took her back to the well itself, where she requested permission to examine the rope mechanism more closely. The constable on duty, recognizing her reputation for harmless curiosity, allowed her a careful inspection from a respectful distance. What she discovered confirmed her growing suspicions about the crime's premeditated nature. The hemp rope showed clear evidence of recent splicing, not the rough, functional repair one might expect from routine maintenance, but a masterful long splice executed with professional precision. The join was nearly invisible, reinforced with mathematical exactness that spoke of maritime or specialized training. Miss Marple had observed Hart's previous repair work around the estate. While competent, it lacked the refined skill evident in this rope work. "Excellent craftsmanship," she remarked to Colonel Blount when he appeared during her inspection. "Indeed," the Colonel agreed. "Far beyond Hart's abilities, I'm afraid. That splice would do credit to a naval rating. Whoever did it understood rope construction at a fundamental level, strength, flexibility, and invisibility all perfectly balanced. This technical detail troubled Miss Marple deeply. If the rope had been professionally repaired months earlier, as routine maintenance might suggest, it should show considerably more weathering. The hemp's color and the whipping thread's brightness indicated much more recent work, perhaps within weeks of Mrs. Vale's death. This timing suggested preparation rather than coincidence. Her investigation of the missing portfolio proved equally illuminating. Alice at Dower Cottage remained adamant about its existence and significance in Mrs. Vale's daily routine. "She never went anywhere without it, miss," Alice insisted, her distress evident, especially on her trips to London and Much Benham. "I saw her checking its contents at the writing desk before she left for the flower show. She said something about having everything needed to set matters right." Mrs. Blount's testimony corroborated this account. "She placed it on the chair beside her during tea service," the housekeeper confirmed. "A flat leather case with brass corners, quite distinctive. But when the constable inventoried her effects, there was no mention of such an item. The portfolio's absence spoke volumes about motive. Mrs. Vale had been methodically building a case about historical injustices, gathering documentary evidence to support her claims about Sarah Whitmore's disappearance and the church fund scandal. Its disappearance indicated that someone had taken considerable risk to retrieve it, either before or after the murder. Miss Marple also reconsidered the condition of Mrs. Vale's gloves, which had struck her as remarkably pristine for someone who had supposedly struggled with the heavy well cover. The white kid leather showed no tears, no dirt, no signs of desperate scrabbling that one would expect from someone fighting for purchase as ancient stone and iron gave way beneath their hands. This suggested a sudden, incapacitating attack rather than an accidental fall. As evening approached and Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, the pattern had become unmistakably clear. The blue ribbon connected Mrs. Vale's death to Sarah Whitmore's mysterious disappearance 20 years earlier. The professionally spliced rope indicated careful preparation by someone with specialized skills. The missing portfolio revealed that Mrs. Vale's research had posed a genuine threat to someone's carefully constructed respectability. The pristine gloves suggested surprise rather than struggle. These elements collectively painted a picture not of tragic accident or even impulsive violence, but of calculated murder designed to appear accidental. The killer had not only eliminated Mrs. Vale, but had deliberately left clues pointing to the past, either as a form of twisted justice or to confuse the investigation. While the village might find comfort in Tom Hartwell as their convenient villain, Miss Marple was now certain that the real murderer remained free, protected by decades of respectability and the community's eagerness to embrace simple explanations for complex crimes. The truth lay buried beneath layers of carefully maintained deception, but the seemingly insignificant details were beginning to illuminate a path toward justice. The morning after her discoveries about the ribbon and rope brought Miss Marple a revelation that transformed her understanding of the entire case. It arrived through the most prosaic of channels, a mislabeled envelope that Mrs. Pratt discovered while sorting the accumulated correspondence for Dower Cottage. Most peculiar, Miss Marple, Mrs. Pratt confided, adjusting her spectacles as she examined the envelope. This letter is addressed to Miss R. Whitmore, but has been corrected in different ink to Mrs. R. Vale. The return address is from Pemberton. Graves and Associates in Lincoln's Inn Fields. They've been corresponding with her regularly. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as the implications crystallized. When Alice granted her permission to examine Mrs. Vale's personal effects more thoroughly, she discovered a small tin box in the sewing basket containing items Inspector Craddock had overlooked. Inside lay a delicate gold locket containing a miniature photograph of a young woman with luminous eyes and dark hair, bound with cerulean silk. On the reverse, in careful script, were the initials S.W. and a date from 20 years past. She looked at that every evening, Alice confided, said it reminded her of what must be put right. The connection was unmistakable. Mrs. Rosalind Vale was Sarah Whitmore's daughter, returned to St. Mary Mead not as a casual researcher, but as a determined avenger seeking to clear her mother's name and expose the truth behind her mysterious disappearance. With Inspector Craddock's grudging permission, Miss Marple telephoned the London solicitors. The junior partner, Mr. Graves, proved forthcoming once proper identification was established. Mrs. Vale retained our services 3 months ago, he explained with professional precision. Her objective was to investigate the disappearance of one Sarah Whitmore from St. Mary Mead in April 1929 and certain irregularities surrounding the church building fund. Mrs. Vale supplied extensive documentation, parish records, property transfers, and evidence of suspicious financial transactions from that period. Inspector Craddock, who had appropriated the telephone with official authority, pressed for details. What was Mrs. Vale's specific interest in this matter? Mrs. Vale was born Rosalind Whitmore, came the startling reply. Sarah Whitmore was her mother. She learned this only upon her husband's recent death when family papers came to light. She had compelling reason to believe her mother did not abscond with church funds, as local gossip suggested, but met with foul play. She hoped to clear her mother's name and compel restitution of misdirected monies. The solicitor continued, Our client indicated that the then church treasurer, Mr. Horace Pemberton, had obscured financial irregularities through fictitious documentation, and that certain village residents benefited materially from property transfers whose consideration was never properly accounted. She also mentioned the atmosphere of intimidation that preceded her mother's disappearance, believing some of the same individuals still held influence in the community. This revelation recast every aspect of the investigation. Miss Marple immediately sought out Dr. Haydock, finding him in his surgery reviewing patient files with unusual intensity. When she gently broached the subject of his former engagement, his reaction was immediate and profound. Sarah Whitmore, he repeated slowly, his face draining of colour.
I haven't spoken that name in years. If Mrs. Vale was truly Sarah's daughter— He stopped abruptly, professional composure cracking entirely. My God, if that's true, then everything we believed about Sarah's guilt— You never believed she was—
Guilty, did you? Miss Marple observed with gentle certainty.
Never. Not for a moment. Sarah was incapable of theft or deception on such a scale, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. Her signature on withdrawal slips, her access to fund accounts, her sudden disappearance when confronted. What else could anyone think?
Haydock's genuine anguish suggested ignorance of Mrs. Vale's true identity, but his obvious distress revealed the depth of old wounds that Mrs. Vale's investigation had threatened to reopen. Margaret Haydock's reaction proved far more complex and troubling. Miss Marple encountered her at the village shop, where the doctor's wife displayed agitation that exceeded her usual nervous energy. Her purchases were erratic, packages dropped, money fumbled with trembling hands. I don't understand this obsession with ancient history, Margaret said, her voice rising with uncharacteristic sharpness. The police have their suspect. Tom Hartwell had motive and opportunity. Why must everyone keep picking at old wounds that have nothing to do with anything? Her vehemence seemed excessive for casual conversation, and Miss Marple noted how Margaret's eyes darted constantly toward the door. When Sarah Whitmore's name was mentioned directly, Margaret's flinch was violent and quickly suppressed. Gerald Ashworth's response proved equally revealing, though in a more calculating manner. His usual charm faltered momentarily when Miss Marple mentioned the connection between Mrs. Vale and the Whitmore scandal. How fascinating, he recovered quickly, though his fingers drummed nervously against his walking stick. I'm afraid I know little about my great-uncle Pemberton's role in that unfortunate affair. The older generation preferred not to discuss such unpleasant matters. His claim of ignorance seemed particularly unconvincing given his obvious intelligence and current financial difficulties, which might make knowledge of hidden assets extremely valuable. The historical pattern was becoming devastatingly clear. Sarah Whitmore's disappearance in 1929 had benefited multiple individuals who had built 20 years of respectability upon the foundation of her disgrace. Dr. Haydock had married Margaret shortly after his fiancée's scandal, a rebound marriage that had provided Margaret with the social position she had always desired as Sarah's companion. The church treasurer Pemberton had covered financial irregularities that might have implicated others in the community. Property transfers during that period had enriched certain families, while Sarah bore the blame for missing funds. Mrs. Vale's methodical investigation
Had brought her dangerously
close to exposing not merely theft, but potentially murder. Her legal consultations and documentary evidence threatened to unravel decades of carefully maintained deception. Someone in St. Mary Mead had committed the perfect crime 20 years earlier, framing an innocent woman and driving her into exile or worse. Now her daughter's quest for justice had forced them to kill again, but this time Miss Marple was watching, and the threads of old lies were beginning to unravel with deadly consequence. The blue ribbon left at the scene was both signature and taunt, a message that the past had finally caught up with St. Mary Mead's buried secrets, and that someone would pay the ultimate price to keep them hidden. The evening had drawn its quiet veil over St. Mary Mead when the village's deceptive peace was shattered once again, this time not by sudden tragedy, but by the stealthy intrusion of desperation under cover of darkness. Miss Marple, restless with the weight of her discoveries about Mrs. Vale's true identity, found herself drawn to her bedroom window overlooking the lane that led toward Dower Cottage. The moon cast silver shadows across the peaceful gardens when she noticed a dark figure moving with purposeful stealth toward Mrs. Vale's former residence. The intruder moved with familiarity rather than hesitation, suggesting intimate knowledge of both the cottage's layout and the village's rhythms. Miss Marple watched as the figure approached the back entrance, paused briefly to examine the lock, then disappeared inside with remarkable efficiency. A faint, flickering light appeared in what she knew to be the sitting-room window, not the steady glow of electric illumination, but the focused beam of a torch being used for systematic searching. Constable Meadows appeared on his regular rounds at precisely 10:30, his measured footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The timing was unfortunate for the intruder, but fortuitous for justice. The light in the cottage immediately vanished, and within moments Miss Marple observed the dark figure emerging from the rear of the building with obvious haste, moving with the desperate efficiency of someone whose careful plans had suddenly gone awry. Meadows, alerted by the sound of movement and a carelessly slammed door, called out sharply and gave chase. The intruder had the advantage of preparation and local knowledge, vanishing into the maze of garden walls and hedgerows that provided perfect concealment for someone familiar with St. Mary Mead's geography. The pursuit lasted only minutes before Meadows returned to examine the cottage, his torch beam revealing unmistakable evidence of hurried, systematic searching. Miss Marple arrived at Dower Cottage within 15 minutes, her concern for village safety providing adequate justification for her presence. Inspector Craddock, summoned from Much Benham by telephone, surveyed the scene with professional thoroughness, noting immediately that this was no common burglary. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for, he observed, examining the overturned cushions and methodically emptied drawers. This wasn't random theft, too focused, too systematic. They went straight for places where personal papers might be kept. The writing desk, the bookshelf, even behind picture frames. Alice, summoned to assess what might be missing, confirmed that nothing of obvious value had been taken. The silver tea service is untouched, sir, and Mrs. Vale's jewellery remains in its box. But someone has been through every book and examined behind every photograph. They were looking for documents, not valuables. The crucial discovery came when Miss Marple, examining the sitting room with her characteristic attention to seemingly insignificant details, noticed a small white object partially concealed beneath the displaced writing desk. The monogrammed handkerchief bore the initials M.H. embroidered in delicate blue thread, the exact distinctive shade as the ribbon found caught on the well's hinge. Inspector Craddock examined the handkerchief with interest. Fine linen, expensive embroidery work. These initials could belong to several people in the village, but the quality suggests someone of means. Miss Marple said nothing immediately, but her mind was already cataloguing the implications. Margaret Haydock possessed handkerchiefs of exactly this quality, and the blue thread's perfect match with the ribbon created a connection too precise to be coincidental. The killer was making mistakes under pressure, leaving a trail that led directly back to the past they had worked so desperately to bury. The following morning brought revelations about the true extent of Mrs. Vale's methodical investigation. Alice, emboldened by the night's events and her growing trust in Miss Marple's discretion, revealed details that painted a picture of systematic documentation far beyond casual research. She had a small camera, one of those modern ones for photographing documents. She'd set up the scullery as a proper darkroom with blackout curtains and chemical baths. Every evening after her research trips, she'd develop the photographs herself, said she needed permanent records that couldn't be altered or destroyed. Inspector Craddock's search of the cottage revealed the makeshift darkroom, complete with developing equipment and several rolls of exposed film. When processed, the photographs showed Mrs. Vale's meticulous documentation spanning 20 years, parish records revealing discrepancies in the building fund accounts, property transfers that had enriched certain families immediately after Sarah Whitmore's disappearance, and correspondence suggesting systematic intimidation of anyone who questioned the official version of events. Most significantly, the photographs revealed that Mrs. Vale had recently visited the old mill site in Hangman's Wood, the remote location where her mother's abandoned belongings had been discovered in 1929. The images showed her examining the area with scientific precision, photographing soil disturbances and marking locations with surveying equipment she had borrowed from the council office, Miss Marple's own investigation of the mill site that
afternoon revealed freshly disturbed earth near the
crumbling foundation, not deep excavation, but careful probing, as though someone had been searching for something small and easily concealed. Mrs. Vale had clearly believed her mother never left St. Mary Mead alive, and her methodical approach suggested she had found evidence to support that. Conviction. The village librarian confirmed that Mrs. Vale had requested specific books about forensic archaeology and methods for locating burial sites. The stationery shop owner recalled her purchasing detailed ordnance survey maps focusing on Hangman's Wood and the surrounding countryside, asking practical questions about soil composition and drainage patterns that seemed more investigative than academic. Mrs. Vale had been building toward a formal accusation of murder, armed with photographic evidence, legal consultation, and possibly physical proof discovered at the mill site. Her systematic approach had clearly identified not merely theft and fraud, but the location where her mother's body might be found. Evidence that would have destroyed the carefully constructed respectability of Sarah Whitmore's killer. The break-in at Dower Cottage demonstrated the mounting
pressure on the real murderer.
The systematic search, the dropped handkerchief, and the increasing desperation all pointed to someone who had built 20 years of respectability on the foundation of Sarah Whitmore's death. They had committed the perfect crime once, framing an innocent woman and disposing of her body so completely that her disappearance could be explained as guilty flight. Now her daughter's methodical investigation threatened to expose not merely historical injustice but contemporary murder. As evening approached and Miss Marple walked home through streets that seemed less peaceful than before, she reflected on the pattern emerging from these revelations. The blue thread connecting the handkerchief to the ribbon, the professional skill evident in both crimes, and the intimate knowledge of village routines all pointed to someone whose fall would shock a community that thought it knew its most respectable citizens. The killers increasing. Desperation made them more dangerous than ever, but also more prone to the kind of mistakes that would ultimately ensure justice for both Sarah Whitmore and her determined daughter. The invitation to tea arrived on cream paper in Miss Marple's careful script, extending sympathy and suggesting that neighbourly comfort might ease the village's troubled spirits. By 4 o'clock, her sitting room had been arranged with deliberate care, the best china gleaming on lace, late roses providing genteel atmosphere, and chairs positioned to afford clear observation of each guest's reactions. Dr. Haydock arrived with Margaret, whose nervous energy seemed more pronounced than usual. Gerald Ashworth followed with his customary charm, while Mrs. Pratt bustled in with the satisfied air of someone whose presence was essential to any village gathering. Colonel Blount completed the carefully selected group, his military bearing slightly uncomfortable with social obligations. Miss Marple allowed conversation to flow through comfortable channels, the approaching harvest, plans for the Christmas bazaar, concerns about the unseasonable warmth. Only when her guests had settled into casual discourse did she introduce the topic that would reveal the truth lurking beneath St. Mary
Mead's peaceful surface. I've
been thinking about poor Mrs. Vale, she said, refilling teacups with motherly attention. Her tragic accident reminds me so vividly of a case I encountered years ago in Dorset. A woman found dead under circumstances that initially appeared accidental, but proved quite deliberately planned. Margaret Haydock's teacup rattled against its saucer, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Gerald Ashworth leaned forward with apparent interest, though his knuckles had whitened where he gripped his cup handle. The fascinating aspect, Miss Marple continued gently, was how the murderer used personal objects to create false connections. They left a distinctive blue ribbon at the scene, such a pretty shade, cerulean silk, making it appear connected to an old village scandal. But the ribbon's placement was so deliberate, so precisely positioned, that it actually revealed the killer's intimate knowledge of both past and present. She paused to offer more tea, watching faces with the peripheral vision that years of observation had perfected. Margaret Haydock had gone very still, her nervous fidgeting replaced by rigid attention. When Miss Marple's gaze met hers directly, she looked away with guilty haste. The victim had been carrying important documents too, a leather portfolio that disappeared after her death. The killer retrieved it because it contained evidence that would have exposed decades-old crimes, but the very act of taking them proved the death was no accident. Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably, professional training warring with growing unease as he processed the implications. The breakthrough came, Miss Marple added thoughtfully, when someone noticed technical details that revealed specialized knowledge. The rope mechanism had been expertly repaired, not rough maintenance work, but a masterful long splice that would be invisible when passing over pulleys. "Long splice is correct," Gerald said automatically, his voice carrying the authority of expertise. A short splice would bulk at the sheave. "For invisible joining, one employs a long splice with proper lay and—" He stopped abruptly, color draining from his face as he realized what he had revealed. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the mantle. Clock. Mrs. Pratt's eyes darted between faces with a postmistress's swift mental filing, storing details for later analysis. "How very knowledgeable," Miss Marple observed mildly.
I should never have remembered the technical distinctions correctly. "Yachting manuals," Gerald said too quickly, his usual charm faltering.
One absorbs such information, of course, though I did find it curious that someone broke into Dower Cottage searching for something specific. The intruder left behind a monogrammed handkerchief. Such carelessness suggests mounting desperation. Miss Marple's eyes found Margaret Haydock's frozen face. The initials were M.H. embroidered in blue thread that matched the ribbon perfectly. Margaret's composure shattered completely. She stood abruptly, knocking over her teacup, china crashing against the table with violent finality.
"I must go," she gasped, her voice breaking.
"David will be wondering where I am." But her husband was staring at her with dawning horror, professional loyalty warring with terrible comprehension as he processed Miss Marple's careful revelations. Miss Marple set down her own teacup with deliberate calm. The psychological test was complete, and the results were unmistakable. 2 people in her sitting room had revealed guilty knowledge: Gerald, through his automatic technical correction that demonstrated expertise in rope work, and Margaret through her violent reaction to the handkerchief detail that connected her to both crime scenes. The threads were finally coming together, weaving a pattern of deception that reached back 20 years to Sarah Whitmore's disappearance and forward to Mrs. Vale's methodical quest for justice. The village's carefully buried secrets were about to be exposed, and the respectable facade that had protected 2 murderers was crumbling under the gentle but relentless pressure of Miss Marple's quiet investigation. As her guests departed in uncomfortable silence, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals were often those who believed their respectability made them invisible. But human nature, she had learned long ago, always revealed itself to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to understand what they were seeing. The drawing room at Blount Hall had witnessed many significant gatherings in its long history, but perhaps none carried the weight of the assembly Miss Marple had requested for the following evening. The autumn light had faded to darkness beyond the tall windows, and Colonel Blount's carefully arranged lamps cast pools of warm illumination that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the shadows gathering around the assembled company. Inspector Craddock stood near the fireplace, his notebook closed for once, understanding that this evening would require listening rather than questioning. Dr. Haydock sat rigidly beside his wife Margaret, whose composure had not recovered from the previous afternoon's revelations. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small handkerchief. Not, Miss Marple noted, one of the fine Irish linen pieces with blue embroidery. Gerald Ashworth maintained his customary charm near the window, though tension showed in his carefully controlled posture. Mrs. Pratt occupied her chosen chair with the satisfied air of someone whose presence was essential to village proceedings, while Tom Hartwell stood awkwardly by the door, recently released, but still bearing the weight of false accusation. Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting, the gentle click of needles providing a deceptively peaceful counterpoint to the gravity of her purpose. "Thank you all for coming," she began quietly. "I asked Colonel Blount to gather us because the time has come to speak the truth about Mrs. Rosalind Vale's death and about an older tragedy that has haunted this village for 20 years. She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. Miss Vale did not come to St. Mary Mead by chance. She came with a specific purpose, driven by a daughter's love and a quest for justice. For Mrs. Rosalind Vale was born Rosalind Whitmore, the daughter of Sarah Whitmore, who vanished from our village in April of 1929 under circumstances that have never been properly understood. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Dr. Haydock's face went pale, while Margaret's trembling intensified visibly. The official story, Miss Marple continued gently, was that Sarah Whitmore had absconded with funds from the church building account. But that story was a carefully constructed lie designed to cover a far more terrible crime. Sarah Whitmore never left St. Mary Mead alive. She was murdered when she discovered systematic embezzlement of church funds by someone she trusted, someone whose position gave them access to both money and records, Miss Marple's. Knitting needles paused as she looked around the room. Sarah had been helping with the church accounts, as was her custom. Her careful eye detected irregularities that the official treasurer, Mr. Horace Pemberton, had been concealing. But Sarah's discovery threatened more than just Pemberton's reputation. It threatened the carefully laid plans of his accomplice, someone who stood to benefit greatly from both the stolen funds and Sarah's convenient disappearance. Margaret Haydock made a small, strangled sound, her face draining of all colour. "The murder was planned with meticulous care," Miss Marple explained, her voice remaining gentle despite the horror of her words. "Sarah was lured to a meeting at the old mill site in Hangman's Wood, where she was killed and her body disposed of in the deep pools near the foundation. Her personal effects were then scattered to suggest she had fled in shame, and the embezzlement was blamed entirely on her." Dr. Haydock found his voice, though it was barely audible. "Margaret?" Miss Marple nodded sadly. "I'm afraid so, Doctor. Your wife was Sarah's closest friend, her confidant in matters of the heart. She knew of Sarah's engagement plans, her hopes for the future, and her discovery of the church fund irregularities. But Margaret also harboured a secret passion for you, Doctor, a love that could never be fulfilled while Sarah lived." The room had grown so quiet that the tick of the mantel clock seemed unnaturally loud. Margaret sat frozen, her eyes wide, with the trapped look of a cornered animal. When Sarah confided her concerns about the missing funds, Margaret saw opportunity rather than duty. She approached Pemberton, not to report the theft, but to propose a solution that would benefit them both. The stolen money would provide Margaret with the means to establish herself as a suitable wife for a respected doctor, while Pemberton would escape exposure through Sarah's convenient disgrace. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking. The plan required intimate knowledge of Sarah's habits, access to her personal effects, and the ability to forge her handwriting on withdrawal slips. Margaret possessed all these advantages through their close friendship. After the murder, she married you within the year, Doctor, using Pemberton's payments to furnish your household and establish the social position she had always craved. Inspector Craddock leaned forward with professional interest.
"And Mrs. Vale's investigation threatened to expose this decades-old crime?"
"Precisely, Inspector. Mrs. Vale had been methodically gathering evidence, photographing church records, consulting with London solicitors, even conducting archaeological surveys at the mill site where she suspected her mother's body lay hidden. Her leather portfolio contained documentation that would have compelled a murder investigation and exposed not only the original embezzlement, but the far more serious crime it was designed to conceal. Miss Marple's gaze found Margaret's frozen face. When Mrs. Vale confronted you outside the post office, Margaret, she was not making idle threats. She had discovered the truth about her mother's fate and was prepared to see justice done.
You knew that your carefully constructed life was about to crumble, and you chose to kill again rather than face exposure. The technical evidence came together with devastating clarity as Miss Marple continued.
The blue ribbon caught on the well's hinge was no accident. It matched the cerulean silk Sarah wore in the 1928 photograph at the vicarage, a deliberate signature connecting past and present crimes. You had kept it all these years, perhaps as a trophy, and used it to mark your second murder. The rope splice on the well's bucket mechanism showed professional skill that exceeded any groundsman's abilities. Your father's chandlery at Westmouth provided you with maritime expertise that few village women would possess. You prepared the well mechanism days in advance, creating a trap that would function perfectly when triggered during the flower show's chaos. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely.
She was going to destroy everything,
she cried, her voice breaking with 20 years of suppressed guilt.
All those photographs, all those questions, she would have ruined us both.
David's reputation, our position in the village, everything we built together. Built on Sarah's grave, Miss Marple said softly. And when your break-in at Dower Cottage failed to find all her evidence, you left behind your monogrammed handkerchief, the same blue thread that marked both crime scenes, connecting you irrefutably to both murders. Dr. Haydock stared at his wife with dawning horror. 20 years of marriage recontextualized in an instant. Margaret, how could you?
Sarah was innocent, and I mourned her as a betrayer all these years. Margaret looked at her husband with desperate pleading. I saved you from scandal, David.
Sarah would have been disgraced, and you would have been ruined by association.
I gave you the life you deserved, the respect you needed for your practice.
You gave me a life built on murder, he whispered, moving away from her as though she had become physically dangerous. Inspector Craddock stepped forward with grim duty. Margaret Haydock, I arrest you for the murders of Sarah Whitmore and Rosalind Vale. As the constable led Margaret away, her composure returning with the same iron will that had sustained her deception for 2 decades, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible price of respectability purchased through crime. The village would heal, eventually, but the scars left by 20 years of buried truth would take far longer to fade. Dr. Haydock remained in his chair long after the others had departed, staring at his hands and wondering how he could have lived so intimately with a woman capable of such calculated evil. The life he had thought was built on love and professional success had been founded on murder, and that knowledge would haunt him for whatever years remained. Justice had finally come to St. Mary Mead, but as Miss Marple walked home through the quiet streets, she knew that some victories carried their own burden of sorrow. The village lay wakeful in the small hours following Margaret Haydock's arrest, as though St. Mary Mead itself was struggling to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed. Cottage windows kept their vigil over the darkness, and hushed conversations drifted between doorways where neighbours sought comfort in shared disbelief. It was not fear that kept the village from sleep, but the profound shock of realizing that a woman whose calling cards bore the finest engraving had shaped 2 deaths with steady, practiced hands at the police station in Much Benham. Inspector Craddock took Margaret's written confession as dawn approached, his pencil scratching steadily across each page. Her words came with clinical precision, devoid of emotion, as though she were describing the arrangement of flowers for the parish altar rather than the methodical planning of murder. Sarah Whitmore, she explained, had discovered irregularities in Mr. Pemberton's ledgers that threatened to expose their carefully orchestrated embezzlement. Margaret had seen opportunity where others might have seen duty, a chance to eliminate her rival for Dr. Haydock's affections while securing the stolen funds that would establish her as a suitable wife for a respected physician. The murder at the old mill had been planned with meticulous care. Sarah was lured there under pretense of meeting someone who could explain the financial discrepancies. The deep pools below the broken wheel had swallowed without trace, while Pemberton scattered Sarah's belongings along the road to suggest guilty flight. Margaret's forgeries completed the deception, and within a year she had achieved everything she desired: marriage, respectability, and the social position she had always craved. Dr. Haydock remained in his surgery well past midnight, unable to return to the home he had shared with a woman whose true nature had remained hidden throughout their marriage. Every memory now required painful re-examination. Her nervous energy around certain topics, her careful management of their social connections, her reluctance to discuss the village's past. The life he had thought was built on mutual affection had been a grotesque deception, sustained by someone capable of calculating murder to achieve her desires. He found himself remembering Sarah Whitmore with agonizing clarity, her genuine laugh, her uncomplicated love, the way she had looked toward their future together. For 20 years he had carried the burden of believing she had betrayed both him and the village, when in reality she had died trying to protect the church from theft. Margaret's confession had restored Sarah's honor, but at the devastating cost of revealing his own life as an unwitting monument to her murder. The village's collective guilt over Tom Hartwell's false accusation weighed heavily on many minds. Mrs. Pratt, whose position as postmistress made her the unofficial chronicler of village affairs, sat in her kitchen reviewing 2 decades of observations, searching for signs she had missed. The woman she had served daily, whose letters she had sorted with professional discretion, had been concealing murder with the same composed efficiency she brought to charitable committees. Tom Hartwell's release brought its own complex emotions. Those who had been quickest to condemn him now faced uncomfortable recognition of their own prejudice. His dismissal, his debts, his rough manner, all had made him a convenient scapegoat for crimes requiring sophistication far beyond his capabilities. When Colonel Blount offered him reinstatement with awkward dignity, Hartwell's acceptance carried a grace that surprised those who witnessed it. The psychological impact rippled through every aspect of village life. Gerald Ashworth found himself under continued scrutiny despite his obvious innocence, demonstrating how quickly circumstances could create false narratives. The comfortable assumptions about respectability equating to virtue had been shattered, revealing how effectively evil could wear the mask of neighborly concern. As dawn painted the sky in gentle pastels, Miss Marple sat in her garden reflecting on the human capacity for self-deception. The village would heal, as communities always did, but the knowledge that such calculated evil could flourish behind a facade of respectability would linger in collective memory. Sarah Whitmore's name was finally cleared, her daughter's quest for justice fulfilled, but the cost, measured in shattered trust and uncomfortable self-examination, would resonate through St. Mary Mead long after the immediate shock had faded. The tragedy had revealed not only one woman's crimes, but the broader human tendency to see what confirmed existing beliefs rather than what actually existed. Trust once broken would rebuild itself slowly, and the village would never again view respectability with quite the same innocent certainty. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret Haydock's arrest, and autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle finality of a story reaching its natural conclusion. Miss Marple worked in her garden with the methodical patience that had served her so well in darker pursuits, deadheading the last roses and preparing the beds for winter's rest. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, while a robin hopped boldly near her feet, confident in the season's promise of scattered crumbs. The dahlias where Mrs. Vale had once paused in admiration had given way to bronze and gold chrysanthemums, their faces turned toward the weakening sun with seasonal acceptance. It seemed fitting that beauty should continue to flourish where tragedy had briefly cast its shadow, though the knowledge of what had transpired would forever alter how she viewed this particular corner of her domain. The village had begun its slow, deliberate return to normalcy, though the healing carried the deeper wisdom that comes from confronting uncomfortable truths. Mrs. Pratt resumed her duties at the post office with characteristic efficiency, but her observations now carried a new wariness, as if she had learned to look more carefully beneath the surface of neighborly interactions. The comfortable assumptions about respectability equating to virtue had been permanently shaken, replaced by a more discerning understanding of human complexity. Dr. Haydock had quietly departed St. Mary Mead, unable to continue his practice in a place so intimately connected to his personal tragedy. A note had arrived that morning, written in a hand that seemed to have aged decades in mere weeks, explaining his decision to establish himself in a distant county where the weight of unwitting complicity in 20 years of deception might prove less burdensome. Tom Hartwell, reinstated by Colonel Blount with awkward dignity, moved about his duties with quiet competence, his vindication bringing neither bitterness nor triumph, only the patient grace of someone who had faced false accusation with integrity intact. Miss Marple paused in her pruning to consider the patterns of human nature that had made such tragedy possible. How often she had observed that respectability, carefully cultivated and fiercely guarded, proved to be the most effective mask for depravity. Margaret Haydock had been a pillar of the community, her name gracing countless charity committees, yet she had harbored a chilling capacity for calculated murder that spanned decades. It was a stark reminder that evil rarely announced itself with obvious malice, but often lurked behind impeccable manners and social grace. The story of Sarah Whitmore and her daughter Rosalind was, in its essence, a testament to how small corruptions could fester and grow into monumental crimes. A single act of embezzlement covered by an accomplice driven by jealousy and ambition had necessitated murder. 20 years later, the truth had pushed through the carefully laid pavement of lies like a persistent weed, demanding another life to protect the original deception. The past, Miss Marple reflected, was never truly buried. It merely waited with patient cunning for an opportune moment to resurface, often with devastating consequences for those who believed they had escaped its grasp. Yet there was profound comfort to be found in justice's ultimate triumph, however delayed. Sarah Whitmore's name had been cleared at last, her reputation restored through her daughter's determined quest for truth. The stolen church funds would be recovered from accounts Margaret had maintained for decades, their compounded interest creating a sum that would benefit the very community she had betrayed. Evil had flourished in darkness, but exposure to light had proven its inevitable destruction. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the peaceful village, Miss Marple gathered her gardening tools with the satisfaction of work well done. The truth, she knew, was often painful, a harsh light that exposed uncomfortable realities and shattered cherished illusions. But it was always, invariably, preferable to living with lies, no matter how comfortable or convenient those lies might seem. For while deception might offer temporary peace, it inevitably led to greater sorrow, just as hidden rot would eventually fell the mightiest tree. The village would endure, as communities always did, but it would carry the memory of the woman who fell into the well and the long-buried secrets she had forced into the light. Children would still chase butterflies in the meadows, and life would resume its gentle rhythms, but with the deeper understanding that genuine peace could only exist when built upon honest foundations. Miss Marple smiled quietly as she walked toward her cottage, knowing that human nature would continue to provide endless opportunities for observation, and that truth, however patient its pursuit, would always find its way to the surface in the end.